Thanks, everyone. And since it's the fifth and final day, I'm already losing my voice, so I'm going to do my best and hope we are heard at the back. Can you hear us well at the end? Yeah. Lovely. Lovely. It's a grim topic we are here to talk about. Since last August, close to 680,000, 690,000 people who identify themselves as Rohingyas have flooded into Bangladesh. They're fleeing a policy of scorched earth, of massacres, of rape, of murder, of extortion, intimidation, and forced expulsions. The number of deaths runs into a few thousand, 6,000, 7,000, take your pick, and this is what can be identified. Probably, as we know from South Asia, the number is much larger. The senior officials of the United Nations have called the crisis crimes against humanity. Special rapporteurs, including former special rapporteurs on Myanmar, have used the G word, genocide. Bishop Tutu, who has been a Nobel laureate, has called Aung San Suu Kyi, also a Nobel laureate, and asked her that where has she lost her moral authority. There were nearly 200,000 refugees already in Bangladesh from past displacements in Ketupalong and Nayapara, and the figure is now, if you put together all the numbers, close to 1 million. A generation has grown up in the camps, which has known only starvation, lack of education, and poor access to healthcare and infrastructure. Bangladesh is a reluctant host. It understands refugee crisis, though. 10 million of them were in India in 1971. The vast majority of them went back. More than 95% went back after the war ended. And now it is its turn to host, and there is a huge rupture going on within the country, how to handle with that. There are apparently 40,000 Rohingyas in India, and yet India wants to get rid of them. They remain at the mercy of the Supreme Court. India has in the past hosted Bangladeshis, Tibetans, Afghans, Burmese, Tamil. But now, despite a de facto commitment to the principle of non-refoulement, although not having been a signatory to the Refugee Convention, it seems to want to have them go. Before we get into the identity question and the history question and so on, Jeffrey wrote a very good story, good in the sense it was very movingly written, but an extremely harrowing story of an incident that he witnessed and interviewed someone. Okay, shall we start with you and tell us that story?
Thank you. I really appreciate everybody coming to hear this talk. The Rohingya is probably one of the grimmest humanitarian situations that I've ever covered, and I've spent years working in Africa covering civil war and conflict and famines. And this story really moved me deeply. I went to the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh at the end of September, and my mission was to try to find a story that would really grab people by the shoulders and shake them and let them know that this was an urgent matter of what was happening. And we're living in a very inward-looking moment right now, especially in the United States. It seems very hard to get people's attention to focus on anything. And what we'd been hearing about what was going on the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh was horrible, but just nobody was listening. So my job for the New York Times is to try to find a story that will translate, that will move people. And I like to say that as journalists, we're in the empathy generation business. We should be trying to generate empathy for others. We should be using our empathy to talk to people, to get them to open up. And then we should be wanting our readers to care about what we're writing about. So I went into these camps where there's a million people living in these horrible conditions, and I wanted to find some compelling story that would represent the bigger story. And I did some research, talked to some human rights investigators, talked to some people that were working inside the camps, and I was steered towards a young woman and some other people from her village who I was told had experienced the worst of the worst. So with a translator, I go into the camp, and I meet this young woman. Her name was Rajuma. She was about 20 years old, and she had scars on her face, was very thin, very small, very frail, and we told her who we are, and we wanted to hear her story. So then there's just the sort of logistical, practical issue of where do you talk to somebody like this in a camp with 1 million people, and everybody's watching you as the outsider, as the journalist. You know, you attract this huge crowd wherever you move. And I had a sense of what she had been through, and I knew it was very personal and very difficult for her to talk about this. And so I had to find a space, you know, somewhat private. So we went into a little like a sort of makeshift house in the middle of the camp, and we asked the people who were living there if they wouldn't mind leaving for a little while we talked to her. And I sat in this house with Rajuma and a translator, just the three of us, and she began to tell me her story. And it's an upsetting story, and I know there's a couple little kids in the audience, but this is what's happening, and this is what we found, and I want to share it. So she came from a village called Tulatoli, which was a majority Rohingya village, and they always had these bad relations with the Buddhist people that lived nearby. And I got a sense of how deeply segregated these people live in Myanmar, that there was a Buddhist side of town and a Rohingya side of town. They didn't really interact. They spoke a different language. They had different religions. The Rohingyas are Muslim. Buddhists obviously have their own religion. And she told us that they always lived in fear of the Myanmar army. And in August, there was this attack. It was happening all across the Rohingya area. These attacks by Rohingya rebels against police stations and government outposts. They were pretty small attacks, like in the grand scheme of things. You know, guys with sticks, maybe a couple homemade guns, bows and arrows. I mean, very primitive weapons. But the reaction was ferocious. And a few days after those attacks, these soldiers came into this village and just started burning down people's houses. And as everybody ran away from the soldiers, they began to separate the men from the women. And they made all the women, including a female, between anybody older than 10 or 12 all the way up to older age. And they said, you need to wait in the river. And while these women were waiting in the river, the army systematically slaughtered all the men in the village. Cut off their heads, stabbed them, shot them, strangled them right in front of the women who were waiting in the river. And once all the men were finished off, they began taking these women out of the river, marching them into houses, and raping them, and killing them. And this woman, Rajuma, was stuck in a house, and she had a little boy with her 1-year-old son. And as they grabbed her, she clutched her boy tighter, and these soldiers ripped him out of her arms and threw him into a fire. And she says the last words she heard were her son crying for her. And then they marched her into a house and raped her again and again. They killed her mother. They killed her sisters. She was left dead in this burning house and woke up because of this smoke. And then somehow ran out, totally naked, covered in blood, dodging the soldiers that were still there, killing other people, and made it to Bangladesh like a week later. Now, how do you know a story like this is even true? You know, I have to be careful, just transmitting something like this without doing my homework and checking and seeing if what she had told me was true. But we talked to dozens of other people from different parts of the Rohingya areas that told us almost the exact same experience. And these people were not arranging some, media PR blitz for my benefit. They were spread out over these camps that were miles apart, and they had the same stories. And I also talked to other people in that village who had witnessed the same thing. And then there's the human instinct of sitting down and looking at this woman while I'm interviewing her and watching her react and her cry and feeling like she's not lying. And it left me, just to finish, it left me feeling very helpless. Because as a journalist, I hear these stories, and I've heard a lot of them in my career, and you just, you can give somebody a hug, you can tell them you're sorry, but there's nothing you can do for them. They're traumatized, they're broke, they're homeless. In the Rohingyas' case, they're stateless. Nobody wants them. And at the end of the interview, I just watched this crushed young woman trudge back into these camps, this frail figure just disappear into these masses of people. And that was the last I saw of her.
Thank you for sharing that. And what you do is important precisely because it helps others understand and relate to what's going on, in the hope that the civil society in the countries where the story goes will compel their governments to do something about it. So thank you for that. Shelley, you've seen humanitarian crises elsewhere too. What's happening now? You've been in Cox's Bazar for nearly 3 months, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. What have you seen? And of course, this is a very sad pattern, what Jeffrey's just told us. What's needed there? What's happening?
So, sadly, the story that Jeffrey is talking about is it's all too familiar. I mean, even overnight, 1,200 people have crossed from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And these people have got the same stories. They're orphans, they're young women, they've been raped, they've seen their husbands killed. We meet them at the border, and they've probably walked for 4 to 5 days. They're hungry, they're traumatized, they've seen their homes taken away, they've seen their just lives burnt to the core. So, I mean, from the World Food Programme's perspective and from other agencies that I work with on a daily basis, you know, we just really need to sort of help them immediately. And that sounds so simple because but even getting food and shelter and medicines to these people is difficult. Because what you do need to remember is that, you know, our crisis is just one crisis in the world. You know, there are many other people, there are thousands, 65 million migrants in the world that need help. But when you meet these people and you hear their stories, and we take them to temporary shelter, we assess them, we make sure that, you know, that they get what they need, but what are they moving to? If you look at where you're sitting now, if you were to just put 8 of those chairs together or 10 of those chairs together, that's their home. That's plastic and bamboo shelters that they live on the side of a hill. This was a forest 2 months ago that's just been dug at, tiered housing. They have to go and search for firewood. They live on mud floors. You know, we're in the dry season at the moment, but, you know, at some point when the monsoon starts and the cyclones, this is a second disaster looming. You know, this is again a fear that thousands of people are going to die again. So, you know, just to paint a very grim picture, it's a mega camp. It's untenable. It's inhospitable territory. It's very hard every day to kind of go and to make sure that we don't miss people. You know, now with talk of so much of the political questions about forced repatriation, about, you know, many people have questions. You know, they don't understand themselves. You know, they've got the glare of NGOs and international community on them, but they need answers to very simple questions, and not just least, you know, where is my next meal coming from, or, you know, where do I live and can I go home? So it's a hard crisis to cover, but you know, we need money. Of course, we need money. We need resources, and, you know, like Nick and Jeffrey who cover this story. It's really important that, you know, we don't forget these people. But again, you know, I worry somewhat that the babies that I see in clinics that are malnourished, that they may become a second generation, you know, refugee in that mega camp.
Nick, I want to turn to you, and I'm going to combine 2 of the things I was going to ask you, because Shelley has just referred to the forced repatriation angle. You have a unique perspective because you've been there as a reporter, and Daphne, your wife, is there with Save the Children and has been working in Cox and on a day-to-day basis doing the kind of work Shelley has been doing there. So can you, A, share some of your experiences, and B, reflect on this agreement? For those who don't know, there is an apparent agreement. There is an agreement between the Myanmar government and the Bangladesh government to progressively start taking people back. And obviously people are wary about it. What are the political compulsions and what's the scenario there? And should it happen? Should it go ahead? Because the principle in the refugee law internationally is that you cannot send back a person if that person has a well-grounded fear of persecution.
Well, I'll try to answer that in as compact a way as I can. But I mean, it was interesting what Jeff was saying about having to, you know, verify these stories. You hear these stories when you're there on the border that are so horrifying that you almost wonder, you know, could this be embellished? I mean, could this be exaggerated? But I think the point is that when you see people up and down this border, day in, day out, the same stories over and over again, arson, rape, murder, this isn't some sort of gigantic campaign to sway international opinion. A lot of these people are illiterate farmers. They don't have any access to the sort of technology or the influence that such an operation would require. And so I think in that sense, it's important to point out, because there has been a lot of misinformation coming from certain quarters about whether or not these stories are true, whether or not Myanmar was the Rohingya were burning down their own homes. That was something that was going for a while there. When you walk past a man that's holding a toddler that is black and pink, covered in bandages, who told me that he fled his own home, right, with her, and just managed to drag her out, it's very, very hard to imagine that was something that was done by their own stage, exactly. Yeah. And then to go to the next point about repatriation. So there are many parts with this agreement that are going to be almost impossible to understand how it could be executed. I mean, one of the main points is that Bangladesh has said that no one will be sent back to Myanmar unless it is voluntary. Now, listening to what Jeff has spoken about and what I've seen and what Shelley sees every day, and Praveen as well, of course, has seen these sort of things, it's hard to imagine how anyone would voluntarily return to a place like this. And everyone that I spoke to there sort of fell into, I would say, maybe two sort of camps. There were those that said, like, almost, you've got to be kidding me. I just told you this story about how I watched my whole family executed before my eyes. My village was burned to cinders. I have nothing to go back to. I can't believe that's even being proposed. And then there was the other camp who sort of said, well, the only condition upon which I would return would be if my citizenship was assured, if I was recognized, we were recognized under the laws of Myanmar as a legitimate minority group, reparations for our land and our suffering, punishment for those who committed these crimes. Those conditions are, it is impossible to imagine that Myanmar is going to meet even one of those conditions. So this idea that this deal, this repatriation agreement, is going to lead to a process over the next 2 years, it's a 2-year timetable. The idea that there is going to be any migration of these people going back to the land of which they were, exacted these horrific crimes is very difficult to comprehend.
Praveen, what's happened to Indian compassion?
I'm not sure there is any such thing any more than there is American compassion or any other kind of compassion. I think I should start by respectfully disagreeing a little with you, Jeffrey, about compassion isn't my business. Empathy isn't my business as a journalist. And as someone who spent decades covering the communally charged conflicts that happen in this part of the world, I think part of the problem is that we have too much empathy journalism, trying to create or trying to advocate for one side of the fence and another, and blurring our ability to meaningfully engage with the politics of a situation. Nor is there anything, I have to say, exceptionally savage about anything, at least I have seen on either side of the Myanmar border. I started my career up the road from here, looking at the dead body of a 6-year-old girl who'd had her head beaten in by the Rajasthan armed constabulary, a Muslim girl, in a communal riot. This has sadly and tragically been part of the landscape of communal conflicts in our region for the best part of a century, if not longer. I think what we need to do is address ourselves to the politics of this situation. And with politics, as ever, there isn't one side to the story, nor two sides to the story, but at least 10 sides to a story. And as thinking people, I think it's incumbent on us to have our judgments informed by a sense of history and a granular knowledge of what's going on. With India, Salil, I think what we're seeing is the unfolding of a particularly cynical kind of politics, not very dissimilar to those of the Myanmar army itself. All this talk of repatriating Rohingya and so on and so forth is complete rubbish. And for those of you in this room who have a little bit of grey hair like us, you'll remember exactly this kind of conversations took place during the Vajpayee government and before then. If you take a trip down to Jammu, you'll see that for years and years and years, this sort of nonsensical repatriation business has gone on. So every 6 months, the J&K police will get terribly energetic, pick up a bunch of Rohingyas, stick them on the train, allegedly back to Calcutta, They'll get off at the next station and come back, because nobody's got any papers. If anyone's unfortunate enough actually to make it to Calcutta, unfortunate or stupid or poor enough not to pay a cop halfway, there will be a court trial in which nobody's nationality will be established. Anyway, Myanmar or Bangladesh are not taking back any of these people. So this is a cynical way for a government to establish its nationalist credentials, nationalist in inverted commas. This is meant to fan up fears of the so-called Muslim peril. If you go through official records, you will see that there is exactly one criminal case involving a Rohingya terrorist, and that involves an act of terrorism that was planned outside of India's borders, alleged act of terrorism. But this is a game to whip up passion. It again succeeds because we have in this country a little too much of empathy journalism. People on all ends of the fence perceiving themselves as victims and having, sadly, again, not a granular enough sense of the ways in which they're being exploited and the ways in which they're being used.
But the fact is that India has, in the past, yeah, sure, go.
I agree with you on some levels that it's really important to understand the causes of these conflicts. But I still think there are absolute wrongs. And I think there's not two sides to massacring unarmed civilians. You will not convince me that there's ever two sides to that. There weren't two sides to marching 6 million Jews into gas chambers. There just aren't two sides to what happened in the Rwandan genocide. There is background and there is politics. And one thing I wanted to add just a bit about that in Myanmar, but the people that are at the business end of this violence, there's not two sides to it. They're being victimized 100%. That woman had nothing to do with the politics of Myanmar, who was raped and had her kid killed. Zero. So just to back up, because I don't know how familiar people are with the Rohingya story, but the Rohingya, their very origins are in dispute. Myanmar says these people are not citizens of Myanmar. They are not from Myanmar. They are migrants from Bangladesh. Bangladesh says, no, these people are Myanmar citizens. They may speak Bengali, they may be Muslim, but they are not citizens.
They don't speak Bengali.
Well, their language is
They
very close.
speak a variant of Chittagongese dialect, which is extremely different. I speak Bengali. I tried speaking to them in Ketupalong in Bengali, and they stared back. When I spoke in my Bombay Hindi, they understood me.
Okay, but there is a history of a lot of Rohingya migrating from Bangladesh at one point, and a lot of this goes back to the British Empire. They had to choose where is the border lie. I mean, this was all part of the British Empire. Bangladesh and Myanmar were part of the same empire, and at independence and decolonization, they had to carve this border between the two countries, and they cast it pretty far east. And so they put these people in with a Muslim population, a Buddhist population, a small Muslim minority was attached, was broken off from a country that had a large Muslim population. And so the Rohingya were kind of stuck in this bad situation from the beginning. And that leads to what we're seeing today, and that leads to the camps and what to do about how they're going to go home or not, because Bangladesh does not want to accept the fact that these people are from Bangladesh, and Myanmar does not want to accept the fact that these people are Myanmar citizens. So a lot of this talk of whether they're going to go home or not rests on whether they're going to get the rights of citizenship, right? And they say, unless we get full rights, we don't want to go home. And there's been nothing in the history of Myanmar that would lead us to believe that the government is going to recognize them as full citizens of Myanmar.
No, they have real concerns for safety. They certainly want their rights, but first of all, what they want is safety. There are restrictions about number of children they can have, who they can marry, all in Myanmar, and they don't have citizenship papers. And as I understand the history, that they are from the region of the Rohang Mountains, which straddle Arakan and India. And therefore, they've always been there. The boundaries have shifted, as you very rightly pointed out, that there was a boundary. Myanmar was part of the British Empire till 1935. British Indian, it was part of British India. So their history as separate people. And Bangladesh happened in 1971. And I lived in Singapore, and they used to call Sikhs in Malaysia, were called Bengalis because they were formed part of the Bengal regiment. So the word Bengali has no meaning to what being a Bengali means. So it's one of the successful attempts by the Myanmar government to say that they're Bengalis, but I at least disagree with that. But you wanted to come in, right?
Yeah. Jeffrey, I wouldn't be stupid enough to say that genocide is right or that there are two sides to genocide. Um, uh, of course, the slaughter and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people is unacceptable and tragic. The point is, though, that there is another history that's been playing out in Myanmar, and it's a complex political history. If you look at Myanmar's nationalist movement, figures like U Rashid, who was killed along with Aung San Suu Kyi's father, played an important role in the Myanmarese nationalist movement. You've had other tendencies in the Rohingya tracks. You had a Mujahideen movement wanting to join Pakistan in 1947.
71 too.
71 too, but
Yeah.
even earlier, at the time
Yeah.
of partition. You've had various tendencies. Even today, you have very many Muslims in positions of political importance. And I think it is important to realize why the army has gone down this course and why people in Rakhine State are taking the sides they are taking.
Yeah.
It does indeed have something to do with migration from the Chittagong hill tracts, but there are other stories. It has to do with the divisions between tribals and between tenant farmers that were institutionalized during British colonialism. Much of the land on which the Rohingya are on now were prior to that free-range tribal lands for slash and burn farming. So there is a long story, and if you want to understand why people do the things they do, I think it's important to engage yourself with the history, with the politics of the place. I mean, if you look through the acres of reporting that you have had on the situation in Rakhine, I challenge anyone who's read these reports to come away and name 3 influential political figures in Rakhine who are driving the violence, or to have an understanding of why the Myanmar army has gone down the road it does. And until you have that, you will have theological responses. You will not have a political response, an informed political response, which is what you need to actually deal with this situation.
But where I think there is a common thread between what both of you are saying, and I do see a common thread, and I like to see these commonalities rather than differences. That's the way I'm built. But the two common threads are this, that both of you do think that the Myanmar army, regardless of its historical understanding of the problem, is wrong and disproportionate. And I also think both of you agree that that woman should not have suffered what she did. Yeah. So I just thought we should have that agreement here. No, because I have other things to ask. I want to move on. Yeah. Why does Bangladesh want to push them back? What is the compulsion? You were talking about the elections to me yesterday, and what are the political compulsions in Bangladesh?
Well, it's interesting seeing how this situation was at first. When the Rohingya started arriving at the border, Bangladesh's first response was actually to close the border, which is what it's done in the past as well, at first. And then when the situation became basically untenable, we're talking about 25,000 people arriving every single day across a border that is relatively hard to police, given its terrain. They basically had to open the borders. And that sort of sparked, I guess you'd say, a new sort of opportunity where Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, started to embrace this idea of being, quote, the mother of all humanity, which was the posters which adorned the Cox's Bazar township area near the camps, hanging from every surface. And, people were, she was at the UN, she was, saying, we are willing to take these people on. We are a poor country. We have 160 million people of our own, but we are willing to open the door to these people, to feed them, to take care of them. And I don't think that should ever be forgotten, because there are many countries all over the world, the United States at the moment, my own country in Australia, where refugees are becoming increasingly marginalised, and I think that should be mentioned. In the case, though, with the elections, Sheikh Hasina has indicated there'll be an election at the end of this year. And we were sort of discussing this a bit earlier, where it's becoming interesting to know whether or not the Rohingya will become an issue that will work for her politically. But the sense is that Bangladesh are the ones that really want to get this repatriation deal up and running. I think it's fairly clear to most people from the indications from the actions in Myanmar that they're not really playing ball, for lack of a better expression. So Bangladesh is keen to sort of start this process going, and they're hitting a wall, and they're not getting there. And it has a lot to do with sort of, I guess, the politics of the region, with Sheikh Hasina wanting to court some of the, some support ahead of this election from perhaps Islamic quarters where this issue has been very hot. People are very receptive to the idea of their Muslim brothers and sisters being persecuted. But, I mean, it's hard to know how it will play out come towards the end of the year. There are much wider, much more complex issues at stake in the Bangladeshi political system, potentially, than the Rohingya refugee crisis.
Yeah. Shelley, I mean, we saw some very moving photographs that they are with us, thanks to Shelley. And I have a question for you about the situation in Cox and in Ketupalong and Nayapada and places like that. Jeffrey, you also worked in Kenya before and seen the Kenya-Somali crisis that can develop between the refugees and the local community. So I wanted to reflect a bit on that, Shelley, that clearly Rohingyas are not popular in the region near Ramu and all those villages. And there have been attacks on Buddhist temples, which some have blamed on the Rohingyas. So I just wanted to reflect on that part, that how does that play out, the relationship between the refugees and the communities? And Jeffrey, after that, if you can talk about how Kenya managed that.
So I think the fact is that when these refugees crossed over into Bangladesh, they crossed into a very poor country. Cox's Bazar it has already got a sort of an underbelly economy of drug trafficking and prostitution and people trafficking, and it has a long history of that. So the biggest concern is that they're not walking into some paradise. And I think it's really important to remember that there is a host community there, as we call it, a population now are outnumbered by the refugees, and they have very genuine, valid concerns. That the price of food is going up. There are less jobs. It's more competitive. It's tough when you're an aid worker and you're going in with your staffing goes up 110%. You have resources. You're much more visible in your sort of white cars. I work for the UN, but we're a very visible community of people that are going in with our food, our shelter, our buckets, our medicines, our logos. One person compared the mega camp. It's a bit like a gold mine. You turn up. You saw an image of an aerial shot of the camp, and it's like people just staking their flags into the ground. Which and again, if I could also just I'm a big believer in empathy journalism, because from my point of view, it helps me message the story, it helps me get funding, it helps me appeal to donors, it hopefully helps resonate and raise awareness amongst people that who haven't been there, and who often through social media or through stories they say, well, what can I do? What do you want us to do? What more can we do? Or questions like that. So yes, going back to the tension with host community, it's very valid and it's very genuine. You have a large aid community that are giving resources, that are giving food. When also host communities see food or shelter being sold on the open market because people want cash. If you don't have identity, if you don't have a registration card, if you're not allowed a mobile phone or a bank account, how on earth? We give food in the form of rice, lentils, and oil. I mean, that's good and that's great, but after 2-3 months, that's pretty boring. You want to eat chili and dried fish and vegetables. You want to be able to get medicines. You want to be able to get other things. So I think, it's very hard to do, but I do often think, we live in an age now where we've got to give people more credit for what it's worth. They are humans. They are entitled to rights, to dignity, to safety, and they need to be listened to.
So we now have this huge problem with 1 million people on the border of Bangladesh and Myanmar, and neither side wants them. So the question is, what's going to happen? And one other point about Bangladesh, not only is it poor, it's one of the most crowded countries on the planet, the most densely populated. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but when you get to Cox's Bazar and you start driving along the coast, for the first time in my life, I'd never seen this before, but I saw these huge sandbags like the size of a whale, like the size of the stage, one huge bag of sand. And the Bangladesh government is urgently placing these sandbags to keep the ocean from rising. Bangladesh is going to be the country that's going to suffer one of the worst, cases of climate change. They're going to suffer more than anybody else. There's something like tens of millions of people that live within a few feet of sea level, right? And so it's like a real disaster for Bangladesh to have to handle like 1 million people that just show up in a really crowded country that's dealing with a number of issues: political, climate, and poverty. Now, my experience in Kenya is I had been working in East Africa for 10 years before moving to India a few months ago, and there was a huge refugee camp that used to be the world's biggest until this crisis started on the border of Kenya and Somalia. It was called the Dadaab refugee camp, and it was something like 500,000 Somalis live there who have fled waves of conflict in Somalia. And the Kenyan government, for its own reasons, said, we're going to push all these people back across the border. We're going to dismantle these camps. They're incubators of terrorism. They're hurting our country. There was tensions with the local community because the people that live in these areas are really poor. And they say, well, why are these guys getting more support than we are just because they're refugees? And they see the trucks and the aid operation helping the refugees and not helping the locals. And that creates a lot of resentment. But the Kenyan government was not successful because there was no support to return people against their will. And the UN, UNHCR especially said, we will not give you $1 to help with this effort. And we will not help with any of the logistics or planning. So if you want to try to return 500,000 people, good luck. And at that, Kenya backed down. But there was one other factor, which is Kenya had signed on to this convention to recognize the rights of refugees. And neither Bangladesh, right, nor India, nor Myanmar have signed that convention. So legally, it's in more of a gray area about what these countries' obligations are. And this is going to come up in the India Supreme Court case. What are the obligations to refugees? It's not as clear. In Kenya, they had signed this treaty saying we will recognize these certain rights. And the countries we're talking about here have not.
So historically, the Indian position is that it abides by the spirit without signing onto it. And its record has been rather exemplary in the past, as we saw, and let's see how it plays out. But staying with India, Praveen, I had a question for you that, yes, on one hand, there is a domestic political angle, but India's hands are not very free, I would think, because Myanmar, India needs its help for insurgencies in the northeast. And on the Assam question, India needs Hasina or whoever the Bangladesh Prime Minister is to help out. So how does that strategic issue play out?
Well, I'd invert the story actually and start by talking about what's happening in Myanmar, because I think that's what is driving responses in Bangladesh and in India. And one thing we tend to forget, because there's been all this roseate reporting about the return of democracy to Myanmar, is that this is a country that has been at a state of de facto civil war. And nobody seems to have noticed in India, but while it's been attacking the Rohingya, the last few weeks there's been renewed use of air power against targets in the Kokang and escalated fighting in the Shan state. I just looked up the numbers before I came here in the Uppsala database, and they've had 17,000 fatalities since 1998, of which the Rohingya conflict is a relatively small percentage. So this is a country at a de facto state of war. And what neither Bangladesh or India want is, for whatever tentative gains have been made towards this becoming a stable, functioning democracy, to disintegrate with one more conflict. Let's also not forget that in the Rakhine, the big problem that the Myanmar army is dealing with is not actually ARSA, the Rohingya jihadists, but Arakan nationalists who've been ambushing and fighting the Myanmar army with great success, and has led to another flow of refugees into Mizoram, which again isn't getting talked about. These were insurgents who India back in the days of the Great Game used to support, fund, weaponize in an effort to retaliate against Myanmar's funding of northeast insurgents. So how does this sort of chaotic, entropic Myanmar feed into the geopolitics of the region? And the first thing that's there in Bangladesh is Bangladesh has again been fighting what might be called a de facto civil war, CHT. What Bangladesh doesn't want is for large-scale attacks against Hindus in the Chittagong hill tracts to break out. For this, as was pointed out, to become a sort of mobilizing tool for the right-wing Islamists Sheikh Hasina's government has been fighting. And they're terribly apprehensive about where this will lead. In some of the back-channel diplomacy around this issue, there have even been suggestions to the Myanmar military that, look, take the refugees back to the southern part of Rakhine State, the northern part of Rakhine State, where there are big Chinese, Indian investments. Let the Rohingya not go back there, but find somewhere else for them to go. And I suspect if something finally happens, this is the lines on which it's going to happen, some sort of land swap deal or some camps in southern Rakhine. For India, it's even more tenuous. So India is engaged in what you might call, you all heard about the sort of surgical strikes into Myanmar a year ago. Well, that's actually happening every week. If you travel to southern Arunachal Pradesh, there is skirmishing and special forces operations across the border into the Naga villages on the other side of the southern Arunachal Pradesh, happening on a more or less weekly basis. And that's happening with the tacit consent of the Myanmar army. This government, anyway, in my view, optimistically, but thinks it's on the edge of snatching an historic deal with at least some elements of the Naga insurgency. And the holdouts are the Nagas on the Myanmar side of the border. And it sees the need to keep them under relentless military pressure while cutting a deal with Naga insurgents on the Indian side of the border. So there's tons of little elements in play here. I think there's a widespread realization within both Bangladesh and India, within the intelligence and security community anyway, that the Myanmar army is going about this in the most stupid fashion conceivable. For the last 2 years, it's responded with savagery, which is, I guess, the principal tool ill-trained, ill-equipped military and illegitimate military has to fight an insurgency with. But that this is going to complicate and deepen problems for everyone around the region. The problem is it isn't clear what the answer exactly would constitute. Do you slap sanctions? That hasn't worked in the past. There's nothing to suggest from anywhere else that it would. Do you choke trade? Who does that hurt exactly? Certainly not the military, which profits from the drug trade and from all kinds of smuggling operations. Jade, also Yaba increasingly. And again, what's more and more worrying people is if you follow Rohingya WhatsApp groups, you'll see recent months, there have been videos surfacing of crates of new weapons coming in. Just the other month, you had Thai military officials arrested for smuggling truckloads of weapons going God knows where into the Thai border. So there's this sense that things are going very badly. What nobody is certain about is what do you do, particularly when you have this sort of very bitter situation in Rakhine itself and no political leadership that sees an interest in addressing it.
So you talked about the rosy democratic future, and there is a peacock in the room we haven't spoken about, to use the Burmese metaphor here. There's a peacock, and that is Aung San Suu Kyi. Did we all misread her? At least I think I did. I championed her. I wrote letters to get her out of jail when I was a member at Amnesty and so on. And now everybody considers her villain number one. What happened? I mean, does she have the strength to deal with the military? Does she genuinely believe Rohingyas are not Myanmar citizens? Are her hands really tied? What's your understanding, all of you?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in. I wouldn't want to guess what is in Aung San Suu Kyi's mind. I mean, who could? But on the question of whether or not she has the ability to do more, there are a number of options that she has on the table. It's big for a little while there. Although I noticed this debate or this sort of rhetoric has died off a little bit. The sort of line was, well, Aung San Suu Kyi's hands are tied by the military. There's nothing she can do. In fact, that's not entirely the case. I mean, the 2008 constitution in Myanmar means that the military retains power over, obviously, the army. It has 25% of the seats in the legislature. And also it controls some ministries, importantly, defense. But Aung San Suu Kyi won a thumping election in 2015. She has a parliamentary majority which she can wield, and she could use that to apply pressure in certain areas. One I would point to would be the state-controlled media in Myanmar. Now, they have been instrumental both in the printed press and broadcast, but especially online, in fomenting ethnic hatred against Rohingya. And in the last, I think, week, Bill Richardson, a US diplomat who resigned from Aung San Suu Kyi's panel on resolving this crisis, pointed to this and said, you know, a great place to start would be to get the state media to stop calling Rohingya human fleas. That would be a great place to start. And starting to sort of change that sort of rhetoric, which has been incredibly divisive and inflammatory for stoking at least the domestic sentiment.
Racist, yeah.
And racist, yeah, of course. The other thing is that Aung San Suu Kyi obviously controls the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office issues visas, which have been incredibly difficult for independent inspectors to go into Rakhine. And for any of these sort of solutions that we're sort of, you know, pondering and whatnot, there needs to be involvement with at least the international community or observers of some sort. And I mean, last month, Young Hee Lee, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, was denied a visa to even go into Rakhine State. Journalists have been arrested and are facing 14 years for reporting on foreign reporters, that is, foreign agencies, but local reporters being targeted.
2 Reuters reporters as well.
2 Reuters reporters, yeah, under the Official Secrets Act, are facing 14 years for uncovering evidence of the Myanmar army executing Rohingya civilians and Rohingya and burying them in a mass grave. So there are some levers that Aung San Suu Kyi could use. And when people say, oh, well, if she oversteps the mark, well, the army has the right under the constitution to declare an emergency and retake control of the country. Sure, that is true. That is what they could do. But I mean, in 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi declared herself the state councillor, which was a position that she created and described as above the president. Now, that's an incredibly audacious move, which involved a lot of sort of months of negotiation with the army. And that the Constitution strictly said that she would only be the de facto leader. She would never be the one that is in charge of the country. She then appointed herself to this position, which she described as being above that. So the army didn't step in at that point. So to suggest that her hands are completely tied by this is a little disingenuous. And those that are close to her, including Bill Richardson, say that she's becoming a lot more isolated. She's spending a lot more time in Naypyidaw, in the political the capital that was designed by the generals to stay away from Yangon. And he described her as being surrounded by, quote, psychopaths and enjoying their sycophancies. So without obviously being there and knowing her personally, it's hard to say, but the signs are not great.
If you want to comment,
I would be happy to take questions now. Yeah.
Okay.
May I just,
You want? Yeah, please.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think this whole Aung San Suu Kyi story maybe holds out some lessons in not mistaking political leaders for saints. As you know, Salil was very deeply uncomfortable with the cult of Saint Suu Kyi. She's a political leader and she will ultimately do what it takes to retain power. I actually disagree with you. I think the army, on her ability for maneuver, I think the army would be perfectly happy to step in right now, especially since the wars in the Kokang and Shan state generally are not going very well. Things with the Kachin are not going very well. And I think, frankly, China and everyone else would fall in line and let that happen. I think Aung San Suu Kyi is acutely aware of that. Yeah, sure, maybe a dramatic political suicide would be a wonderful thing. But given what most ethnic Burmans think of the Rohingya issue, which is something you sense the minute you land at Yangon and talk to 2 people, the reality is she would commit political suicide if she stepped in on this issue. Is that ugly? Is that terrible? Yes, of course it is. Is she a politician who lives with the ugly and the terrible? Yes, of course it is. And certainly sitting here in India, none of this should surprise us particularly.
True. We have 10 minutes. Happy to take some questions. Keep it short, direct it to the person, and yes, keep it short. One more time. The gentleman in the blue here, and the lady with dark glasses over there. And if you can say who it is for.
Hi, my name is Sudhant. My question is to Jeffrey. I just wanted to ask you that, can you comment upon the 969 movement and Ashin Virathu, and talking about Aung San Suu Kyi, she's not good in the eyes of the 969 movement, or and she's also not good in the eyes of the Rohingyas. So how did she ever fall in this awkward predicament?
Yeah, thanks.
You know, I actually don't know what the 969 movement is.
Okay, so the 969 movement is the Mabata movement of Ashin Virat, who was this Buddhist priest, monk, who has been using extremely vituperative language. His tapes are easily available. He's all over the internet, and he's been demonizing Rohingyas in a very, very bad way. I think what Nick was saying, I think, is related to your question, that there's a lot of hate speech going out through the media, through the internet, all over Myanmar. And Viratu is, of course, there's another Buddhist monk who actually gave an example from Sri Lanka, which said that if you kill 1,000 Hindus, this was the example from years, it's equivalent of killing only 1.5 Buddhists, and which was a way of encouraging the military to do what it wanted. So you're absolutely right that there is this movement of extreme right-wing Buddhists who do have the narrative, but then there are shades within them too. If you remember 2007, it was the Buddhists who rose against the military, and those were democratic Buddhists. So peel the layer of the onion and you'll find a different reality. Yeah.
Just one thing to add.
Yeah.
It's a campaign of dehumanization.
Yeah.
That's what we're seeing. And you see this across these other moments in history where innocents have been slaughtered. It happened in Rwanda where the Tutsis were called cockroaches, and that sort of dehumanized them and made them easier to kill. Human beings have an instinct not to hurt each other, but if they look at somebody as not human, as subhuman, and that's what we keep hearing about the Rohingya, is they've been called, snakes, vermin, fleas.
Ugly.
And it's the same. You're beginning to lay down markers so you can then take action against these things, and people are trying to pretend that they're not fellow human beings.
If I may, just a small footnote to that, though, that the Myanmar military was slaughtering Rohingya long before the 969 movement came around, and in fairly large numbers. You didn't have lots of journalists taking pictures in Bangladesh, but this is not the largest refugee exodus that's happened, nor the most intense killing. You've had campaigns like this dating back to 1947 and the Mujahideen movement. This is not new.
There was an Operation Nagamani, Dragon King, in 1978, which also had a huge repercussion. Yeah. The lady in blue, lady in Douglas.
Is that on? Oh, hi, yes. And completely fascinating and completely depressing discussion. Thank you for that. But my specific question to Praveen is, from an outside, you look at the huge Myanmar, I mean, I've been there and it's enormous, and you look at the border and the sort of obvious thing would be, why not just shift the border a bit so that they are back in Bangladesh and they do have status. You mentioned about the French and the Chinese and the Indians and why they couldn't go back. What's the vested interest in that bit? There are a lot of resources there. Otherwise, why couldn't you shift the border a bit? Myanmar's still vast. And let them go there and be Bangladeshi or whatever.
Ooh, shift the borders.
Yeah.
I love a war.
Last time Radcliffe tried that, the consequences weren't very good in this part of the world.
Having said that, Salil, I love a war. It's excellent for employment. Newspaper circulations are down. Nothing like a war in the East to sort of help things get. I agree with Salil. We've tried these sort of border drawing experiments. And in some senses, the problem you have today is the result of a border drawing experiment. Communities have sort of been enmeshed in each other's lives for generations, and where you would draw the line is not clear. So you go across the Naf River, and you will find little Buddhist enclaves on just this side of the Bangladesh border, Muslim enclaves on the other side, and this notion that there is some tidy geographical settlement to this. Just isn't possible any more than it's not going to solve the problem any more than partition. The partition of India solved our bitter Hindu-Muslim problem. Ultimately, you need cultures to have some sort of civic language with which they can communicate with each other. And this is a tough political ask. We're always looking for a quick fix to these problems, saying, if only we can find some deus ex machina to sort of fix this problem. There isn't one. You draw another border, you're laying the fault lines for another slaughter down the road. I know it's depressing, it's terrible, but I don't think there is a quick way out of this.
Okay, we have 4.5 minutes. I've identified 3 people. The young man with glasses. Yeah. The gentleman in the blue and the lady with a cardigan on her shoulder. If you raise your hand, yeah. You ma'am, yeah. Yeah, you. And make it very short because, and let's have them one after the other, and then we'll have answers from the
Hi.
stage. Yeah.
My question is that why are Rohingya stateless and why are they migrating and why no state is accepting them as a concern of humanity?
Why are they stateless and why is no state accepting them? The gentleman at the back.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I would like to ask Praveen, then rather than thinking of the emotional solution to the Rohingya crisis, now it's a high time to think about what is the diplomatic and socio-economic solution to the Rohingya crisis.
Okay, thank you. And the lady, yeah.
Yeah, so especially now that the whole world knows that there is a genocide going on, are there any specific reason, apart from the economic interests I can think about, for which the international community and especially the UN Security Council is not pragmatically acting upon this crisis?
Okay, why is the international community not doing more? How shall we do it?
Let me just take a quick stab at that first one. I think we're at a really inward-looking moment. The political turmoil in the U.S., for instance, and in Western Europe, you're just not seeing these crises getting the attention that they used to get. Yemen right now is suffering more than almost any country has suffered in Syria, in recent decades. And who's talking about Yemen? You're just not hearing a lot of attention paid to it. The U.S. government, with Donald Trump in office, has said America first. They've made it a policy to care less about the outside world unless it directly impacts the U.S. This Rohingya issue is primarily right now a humanitarian issue. There's not oil there. There's not big armies fighting each other. They're not taking over big territory. It's about people being abused and traumatized and losing their homes. And there just isn't a lot of interest in that right now. And that was part of our job, was to try to get people to pay attention to the individual lives that are being turned upside down and ruined because of what's happened there. And it's been tough.
I think on the stateless issue, I was posted in Indonesia before I was a correspondent here in India, and in 2015 there was a scenario where we had thousands of Rohingya refugees drifting in boats in the Andaman Ocean where nobody would take them, and it was a horrible situation where they were trying to come into Malaysia, trying to come into Indonesia, Thailand, and the navies of those respective countries were pulling them back into international waters to float. So this is, as Praveen alluded to as well, this isn't the first time we've seen a crisis like this before. They are often called, I think, the world's most unloved people, is that the expression that gets used. So the stateless issue is going to be interesting going forward because we have 1 million people in Bangladesh that aren't going anywhere, frankly, and there are a lot of new children being born. And I'm not sure of the legal status exactly, but I'm fairly certain a lot of those children, they'll be registered potentially as refugees, but they're now in a fresh state of limbo, born into statelessness. And without any future for them, you have to wonder how this marginalized minority is going to go anywhere to find a home, effectively.
And just on the international community, a lot is being done in sort of, I guess, in the back rooms. We're still guests of Bangladesh and we're guests of Myanmar, and we're there to sort of, we're serving from a humanitarian point of view. We're trying to do what we can for 1 million people. It's what we're all saying here today is that there is so much else that we have to compete with in this world today in terms of just other crises, other issues that that what's important is that we change the narrative, is that in South Asia especially, is that we stop this, the passage of these people. They need to stop fleeing. They need to stop escaping from persecution and just this sort of damnation. They need to be, we need to change the perception of who this community is and humanize them to a far greater degree.
I think the answer as to this is just much simpler and more cynical. If you're really talking about some sort of state of peacekeeping in Myanmar and in Rakhine or some international commitment, you're probably talking to the order of 250,000 troops spread out across there and the northern. Nobody's going to pay the bill for that. Do you see any politician anywhere in the region stepping up to base for this. It's not going to happen. But it's also, I think, important to remember that this question of statelessness, the Rohingyas are not the only stateless people in this region left behind from our colonial legacy. If you go to Jammu, where India has the largest number of its Rohingya, you also have Sikhs who came across from what is now Pakistan, living in Jammu and Kashmir, who have not got state subject status 70 years on. The country is awash with people in similar conditions. And the reality is that we are fairly xenophobic, close-minded patchwork of nations who don't particularly like shit-poor people descending and fighting for the little bit we have. And I hate to say this, but that's the stark truth of it.
I just want to read out a few things I had written in a piece about 2 years ago, because I think they also point out to a dimension. Bangladesh now wants to move the camps to a remote flood-prone island called Thangar Char. It probably wants to turn the long stretch of beach facing the Bay of Bengal into a tourist resort, and it can happen. Its soil is like melted chocolate and just as precarious to walk on. It is difficult to grow crops or to build foundations, and it will face the cyclone. What I recall the most in the end is the encounter I had with a young man in his 20s who broke down while talking to me as I was leaving Kutupalong. He wanted to study science, but Bangladeshi regulations were such that refugees were not allowed to pursue any higher education. If a bird lives for 20 years in a cage, it will die, he told me. We have gone from one prison to another. Will we ever know freedom? He asked. That refugee I met was talking about being in Bangladesh, a country which understood what it meant being a refugee, but which kept him in a refugee camp and was unable to return to his country, Myanmar, which was once a dictatorship, but was not ruled by a leader ideolized by liberals who herself had been a prisoner. I had no answers for him, but here we have a reporter, an investigative reporter, someone who works in the international aid community, and someone who's a hard realist. Through that realism, through the optimism that comes from working on these issues, and through diligent reporting, one hopes that there'll be a better future for them. But it's not an easy task, it's a grim topic. So I'm sorry to have spoiled the afternoon.